Okay, so when you conjure an image of the American West, what instantly leaps to mind? Maybe it's those vast unbroken prairies, right? Or wagon trains snaking across the horizon, maybe the iconic figure of a rugged cowboy. It's a really powerful, almost mythological picture. It's so deeply etched into our national identity. But what if that familiar image, compelling as it is, only offers, a glimpse of a far more intricate and often much darker reality? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into Westward Expansion, 1840-1900. We've curated a fascinating collection of historical accounts and analyses for you, and our mission, as always, is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, to give you a truly well-informed shortcut into this pivotal and, well, pretty complex period in American history.
That's exactly right. This isn't simply a story of, brave pioneers just venturing into an empty land. That's the myth. Our deep dive today will reveal how America's understanding of its western frontier evolved, and pretty dramatically. We'll explore the powerful economic forces, yes, but also the philosophical currents that drove this massive migration. We'll uncover the surprising daily realities, the immense challenges faced by different groups of settlers, and critically, we'll examine the often brutal impact this expansion had on the diverse communities that already called the West home. It's a narrative that's far more layered and sometimes much darker than those popular myths might suggest, full of fascinating paradoxes, actually.
Yeah, that initial romantic image of the West is so ingrained. But before it became this land of opportunity, how did early Americans actually perceive this huge territory, beyond the Mississippi?
Well, for a long time, the prevailing view was quite different. Americans largely saw the land west of the Mississippi as a great American desert, basically completely unsuitable for settlement for human life as they knew it. Early explorers like Major Stephen Harriman Long back in 1819 and 1820, they really reinforced this belief, describing the Great Plains as arid and, well, essentially useless. It just wasn't seen as a place to build a future.
Huh. So it went from being this great American desert to an irresistible lure.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst? What caused such a dramatic shift in perception?
It's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly that perception changed. It really started picking up steam in the 1840s. It was a powerful combination. Burgeoning economic opportunities, sure, but also a potent new idea completely transformed this view. This was the birth of manifest destiny.
Ah, manifest destiny, that phrase.
Exactly. Coined by the journalist John O'Sullivan in 1845. And it was more than just a catchy phrase, right? It implied a divine right and, crucially, a responsibility for Americans to spread across the entire continent. The belief was that they were destined to bring, well, their values, Protestant democratic values, and their technology, like railroads and the telegraph, to this supposedly untrodden space, as O'Sullivan put it. It gave a kind of philosophical underpinning, a justification, to what was also a powerful economic drive.
And despite that initial hesitation about the desert, this powerful new philosophy clearly took hold. On a massive human scale, hundreds of thousands of settlers started moving west. Following those famous routes like the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, they really imagined open lands, incredible economic opportunity, maybe a greater sense of freedom. Just think about the Oregon Trail alone. Over 400,000 settlers made that journey between 1845 and 1870. That's a truly staggering number of people just packing up their lives and heading into the unknown.
It is staggering. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's just critical to understand that the West was absolutely not an empty frontier waiting to be filled.
Right, that's a key misconception.
A huge one and deeply misleading. You had established Hispanic communities, a vast array of diverse Native American tribes, other settlers from Asia, from Western Europe. They already lived there, often for centuries. So American expansion wasn't a simple settlement of vacant space. It was a complex and, let's be frank, often violent clash of cultures and peoples. It led to profound transformations for everyone involved.
Okay, so with so many people being drawn westward, what role did the federal government play? Did they just let it happen organically, or were they actively encouraging it?
Oh, they absolutely encouraged it and facilitated it. President Abraham Lincoln, for instance, he was concerned about a potential Union defeat early in the Civil War. He hoped that expanding a free soil mentality westward would help solidify the nation's future, maybe offer new loyalties, and the government used some really powerful legislative tools to make that happen.
Like what kind of tools?
Two key pieces of legislation, both passed in 1862, were pivotal. First, you had the Homestead Act of 1862. This allowed any head of household or individual over 21, and this is really key. It included unmarried women to claim 160 acres for just a nominal filing fee.
160 acres, just like that, with a small fee.
Pretty much. The only real requirement was that they had to improve the land within 5 years, build something, farm it. This act transferred over 270 million acres of public land to private citizens. It dramatically opened up migration to Americans of more modest means by 1870.
Wow, 270 million acres.
It's massive. And the second major piece of legislation was the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. This commissioned the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads to build new tracks, granting them significant land and financial incentives to do it. This ultimately led to the completion of the nation's first transcontinental railroad at Promontory, Utah in 1869. And think about the impact of that. What had previously taken months to travel across the country.
It took about a week.
Exactly, a week. It revolutionized travel and transport.
So it sounds like the government was kind of doing two things at once: promoting individual opportunity for everyday folks with the Homestead Act, and laying the groundwork for large-scale corporate dominance with those huge railroad grants. That sounds like a foundational tension right there.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. This dual approach, fostering both the individual pioneer and the industrial giant, it created a foundational tension. And that tension really defined much of the West's development. It's a key insight, often overlooked. It shaped who could truly succeed out there.
So given those opportunities and that tension, who was actually making this monumental journey west? Did the demographics change over time?
They did. Initially, that first wave of settlers along the Oregon Trail, say in the 1840s and 1850s, it was primarily made up of moderately prosperous, white, native-born farming families. You had to have some financial security, some resources, just to attempt that arduous journey.
Makes sense.
But by 1870, the demographics had expanded significantly. We saw large numbers of European immigrants, particularly from Northern Europe and Canada, Germans, Scandinavians, Irish. They often settled in close-knit communities, especially in the Midwest. Think Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota. And the numbers are pretty striking. The Scandinavian population in the U.S. grew from around 18,000 in 1850 to over 1 million by 1900.
Wow.
German numbers went from just under 600,000 to 2.7 million, and the Irish from almost 1 million to 1.6 million in that same period.
Those numbers really put the scale of this into perspective, don't they? It wasn't just Americans moving around. It was a truly international phenomenon pulling people in.
Absolutely, a global movement in many ways. And we also saw significant numbers of African Americans, known as exodusters. They were migrating mostly after the Civil War, largely escaping Southern racism and violence, and seeking new economic opportunities, primarily in Kansas.
Kansas specifically.
Yeah, Kansas was a major destination. Over 25,000 arrived there in just 1879, 1880 alone. By 1890, over 500,000 Black people lived west of the Mississippi River. Many became farmers, sure, but about 12,000 worked as cowboys, and some served as buffalo soldiers, those all-Black cavalry and infantry units who protected settlers and helped build the infrastructure of the West.
Right, the buffalo soldiers.
And, as we mentioned earlier, we can't forget the hundreds of thousands of existing Hispanic communities. They had already settled the American Southwest long before the U.S. seized the land in 1848. They were already there.
Okay, so despite all these dreams, the government incentives, the diverse groups heading west, the practical reality of homesteading was incredibly difficult. That romantic ideal often clashed with a much harsher truth, didn't it?
It truly did. Immensely challenging. The environment itself was punishing. Dry, often barren land, brutal weather extremes, droughts, tornadoes, blizzards were common. And then there were the insect swarms. I mean, can you imagine locusts covering the ground 6 to 12 inches deep, just devouring everything green in their path?
Unbelievable. Nightmare fuel.
Absolutely. And the practical struggles were constant. Early homes, these sod houses, were made of mud and sod simply because timber was incredibly scarce on the plains.
Sod houses, built out of the earth itself.
Yeah. And as you can imagine, this led to perpetual dampness. Mud literally falling into your food. A constant battle with vermin, like lice. It was rough living. Economically, farmers faced the ever-present threat of debt and foreclosure. The railroads, which were necessary to get goods, charged prohibitive rates for equipment and for shipping crops back east. And there was a cruel irony. As more farmers succeeded in producing larger crops, the market prices steadily declined. Supply and demand drove down profits.
It sounds like a constant uphill battle. Was there any technological aid that helped them? Or did those innovations maybe end up favoring certain types of farmers more than others?
That's a great question, and it speaks right back to that underlying tension we talked about. The expanded railroad network eventually brought in crucial supplies like lumber and new farm machinery. That helped. James Oliver's chilled plow, developed in the late 1860s, that was a key invention, much better equipped for cutting through the tough prairie soil.
Ah, the chilled plow. Okay.
But these benefits, the machinery, the better transport, they often favored large commercial operations, not necessarily the small family farmer. This led to the rise of what were called bonanza farms, massive operations, sometimes over 20,000 acres. They could afford the expensive machinery, the hired labor. They succeeded through economies of scale. Meanwhile, small family farms continued to struggle, often getting squeezed out by these industrial giants. It was a significant shift in American agriculture, moving towards bigger business.
And beyond the economics and the sheer physical struggle, how did this unique frontier experience shape the lives of women in particular?
Well, homesteading did encourage families to move west, so women were certainly there. But life for pioneer women was incredibly hard. Unbelievably so. They faced the same physical hardships as men, absolutely, but with the added terrifying danger of childbirth, often without any medical assistance whatsoever.
That must have been terrifying.
It was. It tragically led to many deaths for both mothers and newborns. It's a real paradox, actually, when you look at women's roles. On one hand, sources describe farm wives working at least 11 hours a day, just grueling labor, domestic chores, farm chores. One woman commented in 1879 that they were not much better than slaves.
Harsh words.
Very. Yet the necessities of frontier life, the isolation, the shared struggle, it often led to more equitable partnerships between husbands and wives. Women often made important decisions alongside the men, and if a woman was widowed, she typically took over full responsibility for managing the farm. That was very rare back east.
So, hardship, but also a kind of unexpected independence.
This greater independence, born of necessity, is precisely why the first states to grant women's rights, including the right to vote, were out there in the Pacific Northwest and the Upper Midwest. There's this quote from Mary Carpenter, writing from her homestead in Minnesota in 1873. She refuses to complain about the hardships, saying, "Even if we do freeze and starve in the way of duty, it will not be a dishonorable death." It captures that resilience.
It's that profound contrast, isn't it? Immense hardship alongside surprising empowerment. That's probably why stories like Little House on the Prairie remain so enduring in our cultural imagination. Even while we acknowledge, the modern controversies regarding their depictions of Native peoples, they really tap into that core struggle and resilience. Okay, beyond farming, what were some of the other powerful forces drawing people westward? I imagine the allure of striking it rich must have been incredibly strong for some.
Oh, absolutely. Huge draw. The promise of instant wealth through mining gold, silver, copper sent thousands rushing west. Think about the frenzied start of the California gold rush. Between 1848 and 1849, it was chaos. Prospectors would descend on a discovery site. They were quickly followed by a whole host of camp followers. Saloon keepers, prostitutes, store owners, gamblers, criminals. Everyone looking to profit off the miners.
The classic boomtown scene.
Exactly, and it started with individual prospectors panning for gold in streams. But by the 1860s, 70s, the easy surface pickings were largely gone. Mining now required significant investment for large-scale, often underground operations. Like the Comstock lode in Nevada, discovered in 1859, it ultimately yielded over $300 million in silver. That's serious money. And this shift toward industrial mining led to the growth of more stable, established urban centers, like Denver.
So it went from individual prospectors hoping for a lucky strike to these big industrial operations. What was life like for the average wage miner working in those conditions? And did these towns usually last, or were they just boom and bust cycles?
For the individual wage miners, life was typically brutal. Really dangerous underground conditions, high temperatures, poor ventilation, constant threats of cave-ins, accidents, explosions. Close to 8,000 miners actually died during this period, with maybe 3 times that number suffering crippling injuries. And attempts to unionize were often crushed violently.
Grim statistics.
Very grim. And yes, many of these towns were absolutely boom and bust cycles. Once the accessible ore dried up, most mining towns faded away, became ghost towns. The government eventually sought to bring more law and order to the region, partly to ensure more efficient resource extraction and stable long-term growth, rather than just chaos.
Okay, so beyond the search for gold and farmland, there was another major industry that dramatically reshaped the West after the Civil War. The cattle kingdom. How did that whole thing develop?
Right, the cattle kingdom. After the Civil War, Texas was literally overflowing with millions of wild longhorn steers, just roaming free. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad completely changed the game. Suddenly, it became incredibly profitable to round up these longhorns and transport them east to market.
Because there was demand back east for beef.
Huge demand. They could fetch as much as $30 to $50 per head back east, which was a fortune then. This sparked the great cattle drives of the 1860s and 70s. You had famous routes like the Chisholm Trail leading north to cow towns, towns like Abilene, Kansas, which just exploded almost overnight to support the cattle industry, thanks in large part to entrepreneurs like Joseph G. McCoy, who set up the stockyards there.
And the cowboys themselves, what were their demographics like? The image is often just, well, white guys.
The reality was more diverse. Between about 1865 and 1885, you had maybe 40,000 cowboys working the Great Plains, typically young men, often in their 20s, and close to one-third of them were actually Hispanic or African American.
One-third, that's significant.
Very significant. And it's crucial to remember that American cowboy culture, the gear, the techniques, saddles, lassos, lariats, even the terminology borrowed heavily from Mexican vaqueros, who had been ranching and herding cattle in that region for centuries.
Right, the vaquero tradition predated the American cowboy.
Absolutely, the foundation was already there.
It sounds like such an iconic era, the open-range cattle drives, but also maybe one that couldn't last forever in that form. What led to the end of this free-range cattle kingdom?
Yeah, it was relatively short-lived, that classic open-range era. It eventually came to an end, partly due to the development of ranches, more settled operations. But critically, the invention of barbed wire by Joseph Glidden in 1873 was the real game changer.
Barbed wire. Simple but revolutionary.
Totally. Native Americans apparently dubbed it the devil's rope, which tells you something about its impact. Barbed wire allowed ranchers to cheaply fence off vast tracts of land, including water sources, which was key. This effectively ended the open range and the long cattle drives. It shifted control of the cattle industry away from individual cowboys and small outfits, and towards Eastern businessmen and large corporations who now dominated with their capital and fenced-in ranches. You know, Cole Porter's famous song, "Don't Fence Me In," it perfectly reflects that changing ethos. The end of an era of perceived limitless freedom on the plains.
That brings us to the idea of the Wild West. It's so ingrained in popular culture, often synonymous with constant lawlessness and shootouts. How much of that was myth and how much was reality?
Yeah, the Wild West. It's important to clarify that while the image was certainly exaggerated, particularly in dime novels and later Hollywood.
Right, the Pulp Fiction version.
But isolated clashes did occur. Violence wasn't non-existent. It tended to be concentrated mostly in those rough-and-tumble mining towns, places like Baudi, California, which apparently had 29 murders in just 6 years. That's pretty violent. Or you had notorious figures like John Wesley Hardin, who allegedly killed a man just for snoring too loudly, though who knows if that's entirely true.
Wow, snoring.
Right. Violence also erupted during what were called range wars, conflicts between large ranchers and smaller ranchers or homesteaders, often over land and water rights. You had examples like the fence-cutting war in Texas in 1883-1884, where people were destroying the new barbed wire fences put up on public lands, and the more violent Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1891-1892, which actually involved hired guns brought in by the big cattle barons, essentially a private army, for a lynching bee against suspected rustlers.
So real violence, but often localized. More about economic conflict than random duels.
Generally, yes. It was often about property disputes, resource control, economic tensions, rather than the romanticized quick-draw duels at high noon, though those probably happened occasionally too.
And what about the social fabric in these rough towns? What was the reality like for women in these supposedly wild areas where there are many?
Numerically, very few women, especially in the early mining camps and cattle towns. Most women present were prostitutes. For instance, one source says in 1860, the Comstock Lode region of Nevada had only about 30 women compared to 2,500 men.
That's a staggering imbalance.
Huge imbalance. A handful of women managed to become businesswomen, sometimes owning the brothels or saloons themselves. A very small number became teachers. Things started to change a bit later, particularly in the 1880s with the arrival of more middle-class women, often the wives of the successful cattle barons or merchants in towns like Abilene. These women often spearheaded social reform efforts. They began organizing churches, schools, civic clubs, trying to promote what they called family values.
Trying to civilize the town.
Essentially, yes. fighting to remove opportunities for prostitution, gambling, drinking, and other vices they disapproved of. This also spurred legislative efforts like the Comstock Law of 1873, which banned sending lewd literature through the mail, and the Page Act of 1875, aimed at prohibiting the transport of women into the U.S., specifically for prostitution. Though, despite these efforts, houses of ill repute certainly persisted. It was definitely a clash of cultures, even within the white settler community itself.
Okay, as we peel back these layers of opportunity and challenge, the gold rushes, the farming, the cattle drives, there's a vital and often incredibly painful truth we really need to confront about this expansion, which is that the land wasn't empty. Westward expansion wasn't into some void. It violently collided with existing Native American, Hispanic, and Chinese communities, irrevocably changing their lives, often for the worse.
This is the critical and often tragic part of the story. Focusing first on Native Americans, the stage was sadly set by the legacy of earlier policies, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the infamous Trail of Tears, which had already forcibly moved many tribes east of the Mississippi. The initial strategy in the West was often to negotiate treaties. For instance, the first Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. It established tribal borders, created a reservation system, and promised annuity payments from the government.
But those promises often weren't kept.
Frequently not. The annuity payments often didn't reach the tribes or were insufficient. And more importantly, settler encroachment onto treaty lands was constant, leading to inevitable friction and violence regardless of what the treaty said.
It sounds like a heartbreaking repeating cycle. Treaties made, promises broken, settlers push further, leading to conflict.
That's precisely what happened again and again. And it escalated into major violence. You had incidents like the Dakota War in Minnesota in 1862. After treaty violations and starvation, some Dakota Sioux attacked settlements, killing over 1,000 white settlers. The government response was harsh. It culminated in Lincoln's government ordering the execution of 38 Dakota men, still the largest single mass execution in U.S. history.
38 men executed at once.
Yes. Then there was the horrific Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1864. Colonel John Chivington's militia attacked a peaceful encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho. They murdered over 100 people, mostly women and children, despite the fact that the Native Americans were flying American and white surrender flags. Chivington later reportedly displayed scalps and body parts as trophies back in Denver.
My God, to think of such brutality occurring under a white flag of surrender. It's just sickening. How did these horrific incidents shape further government policy and Native American resistance?
Well, it certainly didn't lead to reconciliation. It largely reinforced the U.S. government's determination to remove Native populations from desirable lands and confine them to reservations. Further relocations followed with treaties like the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie and the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, moving tribes to even more remote, often less desirable reservation lands. But then, of course, gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, land sacred to the Lakota Sioux and guaranteed to them by treaty.
Gold again.
Gold again. Illegal invasions by right miners flooded the territory. When the tribes refused the government's offer to buy or lease the land, the government essentially moved to force them out, leading to war. This culminated in the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana in 1876, perhaps the most famous battle of the American West. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others led a united force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. They famously defeated Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry Detachment, resulting in the deaths of Custer and 262 of his U.S. troops. It was the single greatest loss of U.S. troops to a Native American force during this entire era.
Little Bighorn is often remembered, almost mythologized, as this iconic Native American victory. But what was its broader impact beyond that single, admittedly stunning battle? Did it fundamentally change the trajectory of the Indian Wars?
Sadly, no. It was a major victory, yes, tactically brilliant. But strategically, it didn't fundamentally alter the outcome. The U.S. military resources were just too vast. Native American resistance, however valiant, ultimately failed in the face of overwhelming numbers and firepower. We see this poignant truth captured in Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce's famous surrender speech in 1877 after his tribe's desperate 1,500-mile fighting retreat failed just short of the Canadian border. He said, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever."
I will fight no more forever. Such powerful words.
Heartbreaking. The final major tragic event, often cited as the end of the Indian Wars, was the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota in 1890. U.S. troops surrounded a group of Lakota, many of whom were participating in the Ghost Dance spiritual movement, which the Army misinterpreted as hostile. They opened fire indiscriminately with rifles and Hotchkiss guns, killing between 150 and 300 Lakota people, many of them unarmed women and children seeking shelter in a ravine.
A massacre, not a battle.
Absolutely a massacre. And incredibly, 20 medals of honor were awarded to U.S. soldiers who participated. Wounded Knee really marked a shift from outright military conflict towards a policy of forced assimilation or Americanization. The goal now was to erase Native cultures and absorb Native Americans into mainstream white society. The cornerstones of this policy were individual land ownership, breaking up communal lands, conversion to Christianity, and Western education.
And the boarding schools played a big role in that.
A huge and often devastating role. Boarding schools, like the famous Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, forcibly removed children from their homes and families, sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles away. They cut their hair, forbid them from speaking their native languages or practicing their traditions, dressed them in uniforms. The stated goal was kill the Indian, save the man. It was deeply traumatizing for generations, severing cultural ties and inflicting lasting psychological wounds. Alongside this was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. This broke up communally owned tribal lands, dividing them into individual allotments, usually 160 acres per family head. The idea was to turn Native Americans into individual farmers like white homesteaders. But the plots were often unsuitable for farming, and Native people lacked the capital or experience. Crucially, the vast amounts of land deemed surplus after allotment, about 80 million acres, were then sold off, mostly to white settlers and corporations.
So the Dawes Act effectively resulted in a massive loss of native land.
Exactly, a huge loss. And full U.S. citizenship for all Native Americans wasn't granted until 1924. It was a systematic dismantling of tribal sovereignty and culture.
Just devastating. And it wasn't only Native Americans whose lives were irrevocably altered by this westward push. The story of Chinese immigrants in the West is equally complex and often equally tragic. How did their experience unfold during this period?
Right. Their influx really began in earnest during the gold rush. The numbers grew rapidly from about 650 in California in 1849 to over 300,000 in the U.S. by 1880, with most concentrated on the West Coast, especially California. They played an absolutely crucial role in the development of the West, most famously in building the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad through the treacherous Sierra Nevada mountains, often doing the most dangerous, backbreaking work for lower pay than white workers.
So essential labor, particularly for the railroads.
Essential. Many arrived through what was called a credit ticket system, meaning they were deeply indebted to American businessmen or Chinese brokers who paid their passage, essentially trapping them in labor until the debt was repaid. Another key factor was the severely imbalanced gender ratio. By 1890, less than 5% of the Chinese population in the U.S. was female. This created unique social challenges and structures within their communities.
It sounds like they were absolutely essential to building the infrastructure of the West. Yet, despite these critical contributions, they faced immense discrimination almost immediately. What drove that hostility?
Almost from the moment they arrived, yes. They faced harsh discrimination and escalating violence. It was driven by a toxic mix of economic anxieties, white workers fearing competition for jobs, and deep-seated racial prejudice. This manifested in many ways. Special taxes were levied specifically on foreign miners, primarily targeting the Chinese. They were often forced into segregated Chinatowns. Anti-coolie clubs formed, organizing boycotts of Chinese businesses and workers, and lobbying aggressively for anti-Chinese laws.
So, organized opposition.
Very organized. And sometimes it exploded into horrific violence, like the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming Territory in 1885, where white miners attacked Chinese miners, killing at least 24 and driving hundreds out of town. This widespread discrimination was eventually cemented into federal law with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
The Exclusion Act, that was the first major U.S. law restricting immigration based on nationality, right?
Exactly. It forbade further immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. This ban was later extended multiple times and wasn't fully repealed until 1943 during World War II. California's state constitution, revised in 1879, went even further, denying Chinese residents the right to vote or hold state employment. Yet, despite all this hostility and legal exclusion, the Chinese community showed remarkable resilience. They banded together, forming benevolent associations, temples, and social centers to support each other, provide aid, and collectively defend against discrimination when possible.
An incredible story of resilience in the face of intense prejudice.
And then finally, we need to talk about the Hispanic citizens, particularly in the Southwest. After the U.S. victory in the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 technically offered U.S. citizenship to the estimated 75,000 Hispanics living in the territories ceded by Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming.
So the treaty promised citizenship and presumably the rights that came with it.
That was the promise. But the reality on the ground was very different. Despite accepting U.S. citizenship, they were almost immediately relegated to second-class status in their own homeland. The Californios, the established Hispanic landowners in California and others throughout the Southwest, systematically lost their ancestral lands, their large rancheros. This happened through a combination of outright force, intimidation, squatting by Anglo settlers, and complex, expensive legal manipulation. They often had to prove ownership under unfamiliar American laws, facing biased courts and predatory lawyers, processes that frequently led to financial ruin and the loss of their property.
So a treaty promised citizenship and protection of property, but the lived experience was immediate second-class status and systematic land dispossession. That feels like a profound betrayal of the treaty's spirit.
It absolutely was a massive betrayal. Economically, displaced Hispanics were often forced into the lowest-paying jobs, becoming peons, manual laborers, or vaqueros, cattle herders, though often working for Anglo ranchers now on land that might have once been theirs, or cartmen. Or they were assigned the most hazardous tasks in the mines. There was resistance, of course. It wasn't passive acceptance. You had groups like Las Gordas Blancas, the Whitecaps, primarily in New Mexico around 1889, 1890.
The Whitecaps, what did they do?
They were a kind of vigilante group that fought back against Anglo encroachment and fencing of communal lands. They cut fences, burned barns and crops of Anglo settlers, and tried some political organizing too. But alongside this resistance, discriminatory laws were enacted specifically designed to suppress Hispanic culture and social life. Things like Sunday laws that prohibited traditional gatherings and fiestas, or vague greaser laws that effectively allowed for the harassment and imprisonment of Mexican Americans for vagrancy. Ultimately, facing overwhelming Anglo-American influx, economic marginalization, and cultural pressure, both Hispanic and Chinese communities often retreated into segregated urban enclaves, barrios for Hispanic communities, Chinatowns for Chinese communities. These became places where their language, traditions, and cultural identity could survive, somewhat insulated from the dominant Anglo society that had largely displaced them.
Wow. The story of Westward Expansion, when you really dig into it like this, it truly is a profound, complex, and often deeply painful one. It wasn't just a simple journey into empty lands, was it? It was this incredibly turbulent period driven by economic opportunity and this powerful philosophical ambition, manifest destiny. But it was also characterized by immense hardship for the settlers themselves and marked by these brutal, devastating cultural clashes with the people already there.
That's right. And what's fascinating and sobering is that these historical movements, the westward drive, the concept of manifest destiny and how it was applied, the specific policies enacted, they laid down profound foundations. Indeed, you could say they left scars on the country, scars that in many ways are still felt today in land ownership patterns, in economic disparities, in ongoing issues of race and identity.
Indeed. A powerful legacy. So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider, what are the lasting echoes of this era in contemporary American society? Especially when we think about land ownership, about racial and ethnic identity, about the distribution of wealth and opportunity. What does understanding this complex, often brutal history prompt you to consider about our present moment? Something to think about.